All right, welcome everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us for our Menu Labeling 2018 webinar. My name is Julie. I'm the Senior Culinary Nutritionist here at Menu Trinfo, and I'm going to be your moderator for this webinar today. Today's webinar is meant to prepare you for the upcoming menu labeling regulations and get you thinking about what else you can do to be successful. We'll also be covering the recently released draft guidance from the FDA and letting you know what to expect after we reach the enforcement date. Before we get started though, I want to go ahead and take you through a couple of housekeeping items. We have you all muted for today's webinar, so you don't have to worry about the background noise from wherever you're watching the webinar. On your screen you'll see a small chat box, so please feel free to use that chat box to type in any questions you have as we go through the slides today. At the end of the webinar, we're going to be able to get all of those questions addressed and answered. And so we're going to have plenty of time for those questions today, so please don't be shy. Send us all of your questions. If for any reason the audio goes out for today's webinar, just stay on the line and you'll be placed into a lobby and reconnected once we get the audio back up and going. If you do happen to lose the connection on your end, just dial back in and you'll be placed right back into the webinar. And finally, we are recording the webinar for today, but we will not be making the slides available as a PDF. So please take notes and ask your questions to make sure that you can take back all this information to your brands. Okay, at this time, I'd like to go ahead and read our disclaimer in its entirety. The content shown here is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. We are not lawyers and do not claim to be. You are encouraged to verify any and all parts of this presentation with your brand's legal counsel. Menu Trinfo will not be held responsible for fines or other penalties that arise from recommendations that were made following our best understanding of all published laws and supplemental guidance documents. This webinar contains material protected under any unauthorized reprint or use of any kind of this material is prohibited. No part of this webinar may be reproduced or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic or mechanical, including photocopy retrieval systems, without expressed written permission from Menu Trinfo LLC, the author and publisher. Okay, before we dive into the content for today's webinar, we'd like to give you just a little bit of background on our company, Menu Trinfo. Menu Trinfo is a mashup of the words menu, nutrition, information, which describes very accurately what we do. We are a full-service nutrition consultant to the industry. We provide nutrition information through our proprietary software and database, as well as allergen identification, gluten-free menu reviews, specialty menu development, and menu labeling consulting. We also have one of the only ANSI-accredited food allergy training programs in the nation through AllerTrain. We offer a suite of courses to accommodate all facets of the food service industry, including K-12 school staff, colleges and university dining facilities, and of course restaurant and similar retail food establishments. We provide our courses in a variety of different formats, which include live talk classes or e-learning platforms. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without our incredible clients, and we have a handful of them on today's webinar, so thank you all for joining us. This slide shows you just a few of the incredible brands that we have the honor of working with. We want to keep our sales talk to a minimum, but if after this webinar you're interested in learning more about our services or what a nutrition partnership could look like for you and your brand, please feel free to give us a call. We'll be sending out an email to all the participants of this webinar today with our contact information, and we would love to hear from you. Okay, with all of those wonderful housekeeping tasks behind us, let's go ahead and dive into the webinar. Our speaker for today is Claire Willis, the Director of Nutrition at Menu Trinfo. Claire Willis has been with Menu Trinfo for over 5 years and has ridden the ups and downs of getting menu labeling passed and implemented. She and the rest of the Menu Trinfo team have worked with hundreds of food service brands across the country to successfully implement the menu labeling regulations while still maintaining brand integrity. Claire speaks regularly on the regulations through webinars, food shows, and brand-hosted workshops. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Claire.
Nice. Thank you, Julie, for the introduction, and happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on what we know is a busy day for your industry. So we want to go ahead and kick things off with a quick poll question. So Julie mentioned that there's a small chat box on your screen. So if you don't mind, if you could chat your answers in there. How many of you feel ready for menu labeling? All right. We got a ready with an exclamation point. We like that. We have a couple no's. Nope. Lots of people feeling ready, ready, ready. Oh, good. Okay, so a couple no's, lots of readies. Okay. How about the next poll question here? What is your greatest fear or worry when it comes to menu labeling? Maybe it's the price of the analysis of the new menu boards. Maybe it's the fear of getting in trouble, inaccuracy, having the information, or excuse me, having the regulation delayed again, inaccuracy, keeping the information accurate, regulations will change. Excellent. Vendor substitutions, these are all great. So it's interesting that even 8 years down the road after menu labeling was introduced, there's still all of these fears associated with it, which is totally natural. It's a huge regulation to be brought upon the industry, but we hope to show you that it's nothing to fear, nothing harder than what you guys do in your day-to-day anyways. Okay. So let's go through a quick timeline how we got to this point today. So going back to 2010, President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act into law, and that's actually how federal menu labeling came to be. So there was a tiny section, Section 4205 of the Affordable Care Act, that said any restaurants or similar retail food establishments with 20 or more locations had to have calories on their menus. And from that, the rest was up to the FDA. They were the ones in charge of writing the regulations and coming up with the actual rule would be. And finally, December of 2014, we were waiting quite a while for the final regs to be released, but the FDA gave those to us December of 2014, and this set the first enforcement deadline, which was originally December 1st, 2015. And that didn't last very long because in July of 2015, citing various petitions from the industry for more time, the FDA decided to give the industry an extra year. So the new enforcement date was December 1st, 2016. And this was an enforcement deadline that I think our nutrition team welcomed. The regulations ended up being way more complex than we thought they would ever be. It was 100+ pages of kind of jumbled regulations. You couldn't tell where a law was and where it was just talking about the rulemaking process. So we certainly welcome this delay. Then comes December 2015, and a very large spending bill was passed through Congress, and tucked inside was some verbiage that said the FDA was prohibited from using any government funds to enforce menu labeling until 1 year after a final guidance document was released. We didn't have a final guidance document at that to release that document, which we got in May of 2016. May 5th, 2016 was when that was released, which made May 5th, 2017 the third enforcement deadline that the industry saw. And then probably the most shocking on this timeline came May 4th, 2017, one day before the enforcement of menu labeling was supposed to start. The FDA's new commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, he announced that there would be a 1-year delay to give the industry more time and to also open up a comment period to take into account some of their concerns with the regulations, see if there was some extra wiggle room that could be given. So November of 2017, after that initial comment period was over, the FDA released a draft guidance document. And the comment period for that draft document closed in January of 2018. So now we're in this kind of holding period, waiting for this final guidance document to come our way. We're hoping that it'll be soon. We're just a couple months away from the enforcement deadline. We will go through the draft guidance pretty thoroughly later on in this webinar. So we can see what the FDA is planning and what they'll probably finalize, but just know that there might be some tweaks when that final document hits our desks. And one thing that's missing from here, we've already been getting some questions about it, is the Common Sense Nutrition Disclosure Act. And we don't want you to think that we're skipping over that. We will go through that at the end of the webinar. Okay, so let's start with a quick refresher on the regulations. And these are going to be based solely on the final regulations themselves, the final law that was published, and not bringing in any content from the guidance quite yet. So menu labeling was introduced through the Affordable Care Act since it is a measure that will hopefully ultimately impact public health. Nearly 70% of Americans are overweight or obese, and the average American eats about 18.2 meals per month outside of the home. So a large amount of the food that someone's eating is being prepared outside of their home. They aren't in control totally of what's going into it. So this is by no means meant to tell someone what to eat, but rather give them the tools to make a more informed decision when they're dining away from home. And since it is Valentine's Day, we decided to use a quick example here and show you the impact of this information. Today is a very busy day for dining out. It's the second busiest day for restaurants. If anyone knows number one and wants to type it into the chat box, feel free. So here are some statistics. About a quarter of Americans, or about 77 million people, will be eating out today, eating away from their homes. 9.4% of the population has been diagnosed with diabetes, so that's 7.23 million Americans. And then another percent of the population has been diagnosed with heart disease, 9 million Americans. And 14.6% of the population is on a calorie-restrictive diet, which accounts for 11.24 million Americans. So it's not just being about being compliant with these regulations to avoid a penalty. The nutrition information that you're providing your guests is extremely valuable to a large number of people, and that number is just going to keep increasing. Oh, and you guys are good. Y'all got it. Mother's Day is the #1 busiest day for restaurants. So back to the regulations. These are the types of establishments that the regulations are meant to cover. Anywhere that's selling restaurant-type food that has 20 or more locations and who's selling substantially the same menu items, doing business under the same name, those are the establishments that will have to comply with the regulations come May 7th, 2018. And if a food service establishment doesn't meet those criteria, so maybe they're a smaller chain, maybe they are doing business under slightly different names, for any reason, if they want to go ahead and voluntarily register with the FDA, they're welcome to. The FDA does preempt any state or local laws that would affect covered establishments, but it is possible that a local law may be passed that might impact the smaller brands or might impact someone that might not otherwise be covered under the FDA's regulations. So if that establishment decides that the FDA regulations are better for them and their brand, then they can voluntarily register with the FDA. Here are the most basic requirements underneath the menu labeling regulations. Anywhere that a guest can make an ordering decision. So whether that's standing in line at a quick serve and seeing a menu board, or sitting down at a dine-in restaurant and being handed a paper menu, going through a drive-through, at a convenience store, looking at a wall of fountain drinks. Anywhere where a guest has all of the tools at their disposal to make a decision on what they want to eat, the FDA wants there to be calorie information available. In addition to calories, there are 2 disclaimers that must be posted. The first one is 2,000 calories a day is used for general nutrition advice, but calorie needs vary. If you do have a specific kids menu, there is another version that you can use that has those numbers tweaked for a kid. And the second one is additional nutrition information available upon request, and we'll go over what that means in just a couple minutes. So when we're talking about restaurant-type food, these are all of the items that the FDA would require to be labeled. So anything that can be consumed immediately or as soon as someone gets to work, home, school, whatever it may be. So Obviously, food sold for immediate consumption at a restaurant, that's an obvious one. Food that's purchased at a drive-through or at a takeout establishment. The pizza industry is fighting pretty hard to change the regulations in a way that if the majority of your orders come online or over the phone, that you wouldn't need to have calories labeled in-house, but that's not the way the regulation is written right now. So even if you get most of your business over the phone or online, you still need to have the calories labeled in-house if you do have printed or digital materials. Food that's on a hot bar, a buffet, a salad bar, food that a guest can see before they consume it. So something like a burrito line or a sandwich line, or self-service foods at a deli or coffee shop. Anything that you can eat immediately or soon after, that's going to be covered under the regulations. So the good news is that there are some foods that are exempt from menu labeling. Custom orders, so these are items that deviate from a standard build. For example, if I got a meatball sub without cheese, the restaurant wouldn't need to have nutrition information for that special build that I just created. Daily specials, items that are offered just once a day, they aren't set on your menu. They're more of a chef creation. Those are exempt. Where it gets a little bit trickier is with the customary market test items and temporary menu items. Customary market test items, that's when you're bringing a menu item onto your menu to test customer appeal, see if that's something that you want to bring on long term. And you have up to 90 days, consecutive 90 days, to test that item before you need to have it labeled. And that's different from a temporary menu item, which could be like an LTO, a seasonal offering, a holiday offering. If it's on the menu for less than 60 days, consecutive and non-consecutive, then it's exempt from the regulations. So maybe there's a special cocktail that you have in-house in January, and then you offer it again in December. If you extend beyond 60 days with the second time you offer it, then you will need to have it labeled just like it's a regular menu item. Condiments for general use, those don't need to be labeled. And then foods that wouldn't be considered restaurant-type foods, so foods that purchased from a bulk bin, that's not really intended to be something that you eat right away. And same for food that's sold by weight, that's intended to be eaten over several days. Those are all exempt. Okay, and when it comes to your menus and menu boards, there are some important formatting requirements that you'll want to pay attention to. The most obvious is that the calories need to be adjacent to the name or price of the menu item. You just don't want guests guessing which calories go with which menu item. The font size of the calories needs to be the same as the name or price, whichever is smaller. It needs to be easy to read on your menu. And then the calories need to be rounded. And this can get a little bit tricky. So each nutrient that the FDA requires has its own set of rounding rules, including calories. So for amounts that are underneath 50, you'll round to the nearest 5. If you're 50 and above, you'll round to the nearest 10. And then anything under 5, you can round to 0. So it's really obvious when you're looking at a menu and the numbers aren't rounded. It doesn't look right. So that's an easy thing to get dinged on during an inspection, so something to keep in mind as you're moving forward. Okay, and I mentioned before that self-serve foods like buffets and salad bars, those are also covered under the regulations. So the guests will need to have access to calorie information as they're making their selections along the salad bar. And I'm not going to say too much here because the FDA provided tons of examples of ways to label self-serve food in the draft regulations. So we'll go through those here shortly. Okay, and the last requirement, aside from having all your menus and menu boards ready, is to have this additional nutrition information available upon request. With our Valentine's Day example, we mentioned people that were on a calorie-restrictive diet, so calories are important to them. But then we also mentioned folks who have other situations where they're going to be looking for nutrients aside from calories. So the people on a heart-healthy diet, they'll be looking at sodium and the quality of fat that's in a food. Someone who has diabetes, they'll obviously be interested in total carbs and sugar. So having this information aside from calories is still really important. There are a number of different ways that you can show this information to your guests. You can have pamphlets, posters. If you have trays, you can have tray liners. It can be printed in a binder. It doesn't need to be pretty. You can have it in a digital format. However, the means of obtaining that information do need to be provided by your establishment. So you can't rely on someone having a smartphone and going to your website. If you do have the additional nutrition information in a digital format, you'd have to provide a kiosk or tablet or something that the guest could use in-house to obtain that information. Okay, and here are the specific nutrients that are required. I mentioned a little bit earlier that each one has its own set of rounding rules. So when in doubt, go back to the regulations. I think they'll point you in the direction of the NLEA, the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, which will give you all of the different rounding rules for these nutrients. And when it comes to generating these nutritional values, the FDA has actually given the industry a surprising amount of flexibility. The only requirement is that you have a reasonable basis behind your posted values. So whether that's using a database analysis like we do here at Menu Trinfo, whether that's sending everything off to a lab, whether that's using a cookbook that has posted nutritional values, anything that you can defend if an FDA, someone from the FDA or a health inspector or a guest comes in and questions your numbers, you just have to be able to show what your process was to obtain those values and why it's reliable. So whatever method you choose is really up to you. It's just that record-keeping process that's really important and really something that you'll want to pay close attention to. Okay, so now we can dive into the much anticipated draft guidance that was released in November. So just another reminder, this is still in the draft stage. We don't have a final document yet. So any of the information here is subject to change when that final guidance is released. And here's a quick overview of regulation versus guidance, which is really important here. So regulatory information, which is what the FDA released in December of 2014, what they released is the law. It went through the rulemaking process. They went through all of the necessary vetting steps to create this legally binding document. And that's different from a guidance document, which does not make any legally binding suggestions. It's supposed to be, exactly what it sounds like, guidance, to give a little bit more information on their thinking when they created the rule. And this is pretty interesting timing because yesterday Jeff Sessions released a memo that would. So what he said is that civil prosecutors can no longer rely on guidance documents to establish infractions. So the guidance documents don't have quite as much clout as they used to. Again, this is all very recent and we'll see how it comes into play. So when in doubt, refer to the published regulations. Those are ultimately what would be used to determine if someone is non-compliant or not. Okay, so when we go through the draft guidance together, something that was really interesting and was different from the previous guidance documents that the FDA has released is that they provided all of these different examples of ways that foods can be labeled, which there was kind of a lack of before. And it's so much easier to look at these and to understand, oh, okay, that's what it means by a poster on a salad bar. So we're just going to be looking at the picture examples from the draft guidance here. There was quite a bit of overlap from the previous guidance, which was released in May of 2016. So there weren't any major changes here, just a lot more examples and I think a lot more helpful for the industry. So starting off with self-serve foods, for hot bars, salad bars, buffets, anywhere where someone is making their own food on just seeing the items in front of them. There are a couple different ways that the FDA allows you to label those items. One is having an individual sticker next to each item. So that would be like on this picture, you'd have a little placard or sticker next to the peaches with the calorie information, next to the grapes, next to the salads. And that's really useful, but it can definitely be cumbersome. They would also allow individual stickers on the sneeze guard. So that's a little bit more out of the way. And I think I'm going to skip forward one. So here's an example of that. So it's a little bit more useful when you have these bigger bins, not so much those little individual containers. But coming back to this one, this is probably going to be the most common way that we see salad bars, hot bars, food on display, so a sandwich line, burrito line, and having one poster that's easy to be seen, so they're not hiding it anywhere, and that lists, or if not all of the available options, decent sized chunks at a time. We think that's probably going to be the best way to label it for the industry, or at least the least confusing way for both sides. So the big thing here with self-serve foods and food on display is that the nutrition information for each offering, the calorie information for each offering needs to be visible while the guest is making a selection, can't be hidden anywhere, and then you'll also need to account for those 2 disclaimer statements that are required on menu boards and menus. Those will also need to be included at your self-serve stations or your food on display stations. So we looked at this example, which is another one that the FDA provided. And these are a couple more showing a hot bar option. So you can see in that picture on the left, they went with a more consolidated approach with a little poster stuck to the sneeze guard. And on the right, they went with individual stickers. Again, both are compliant. The covered establishment has some flexibility with which one they want to choose. And here's a close-up of one of the posters that the FDA used as an example for a self-serve donut display case. So you can see that the name of the item and the calories are in the same font size. So even if there's a sticker on the outside of the case that has the price in really big font, as long as you have the name of the item on this poster, that's what the calories are going to be anchoring to. So you don't have to worry about having calories in size 68 font on the outside. That could be a little unappealing. And then one other thing to note here is that they have included those 2 disclaimer statements on the poster, again in the same size as the calories, just like you would do on your menus or menu boards. If there wasn't a poster for each item and they were using stickers instead, maybe next to each donut offering, then the disclaimers would need to be shown elsewhere. So whether that's a separate sticker on the glass or a pop-up poster on top of the stand, you'll just want to, those disclaimers can get tricky and they're easy to leave off. So just keep that in mind, that if a guest is looking at calories, those 2 disclaimer statements should also be in close proximity to those caloric values. Okay, fountain drinks. This is the most common route that we've seen our clients take, just a simple sticker on the back of the fountain machine. I believe at least Pepsi, if not Pepsi and Coke, have tools on their websites for you to create these stickers based on the offerings that you have. So that's really helpful, and it kind of unifies things for the industry, which is great. You can see the 2 disclaimer statements are down there in the bottom. For convenience stores or restaurants, I suppose, that have a lot of different self-serve beverage options, the poster might need to be placed, on each individual machine, depending on how those are laid out. Just keep in mind that the guests will need to have access to that information while they're making their drink selection. So if you have tons of fountain machines, which we know is the case in some convenience stores, just be mindful of how often you're placing those calorie posters. And one other thing to mention while we're on fountain drinks is that you'll need to have the calories posted for each individual size. So you can't list calories per ounce and then expect the guest to do the nutrition. If you have a 12 fluid ounce small, a 20 fluid ounce medium, and a 36 large, you'll have to have calories posted for each option in each of those 3 sizes. Okay, and last example here for self-serve foods. These are some prepackaged salads in a grab-and-go case, and it looks like they decided to put a sticker on each one individually with the number of calories, which is totally something that you can do if you have grab-and-go foods that have a full nutrition label. That's compliant as long as the guest has access to calories while they're making a decision. That's, again, the big thing to go back to. Okay, so next topic that the FDA brought up in the draft guidance was marketing materials, which I know has been a huge sticking point with a lot of the industry. There was a lot of gray area, and I think there is still some gray, but these examples certainly helped. So if a material's sole purpose is to inform what offerings are available and it's not intended to be used to place an order, then that would be considered a secondary writing, and that would be exempt from calorie labeling. So the picture in the top left, maybe this is at a convenience store. It's outside at a gas pump. It's just meant to entice consumers to come inside and check out what's being offered. No one's placing an order at the gas pump. And then the second picture is a marketing material. Maybe it's a flyer, maybe it's an advertisement that's published in a newspaper. You can see that there are pictures of menu items, there are names of menu items, but there's no price, which is important, and there's no real method for the consumer to place an order. So they haven't listed, call in now to place your order. There's just not enough information given to the guest to make an ordering decision. So that would be considered a secondary writing, and these materials would not need to be labeled. Okay, and then pizza. This is the last example that we'll show from the draft guidance. We've known since the regulations were released that pizza could be labeled by the slice, but I think this example here really shows in a nice, well thought out way how the information can be shown for a pizza restaurant. Pizza is hard to label. I don't think anyone has doubted that since the inception of the menu labeling regulations, but there are some ways that you can make the numbers a little bit more palatable and make your menus stay attractive. So here we can see in the top right, that cheese pizza box, we have a couple different crust sizes, and then we have 4 different sizes of pizza. So next shows the number of slices that it contains, so that way when we show the calorie range, those are the number of calories per slice. So it's more usable for the consumer, and you don't have to have these 4 or 5 digit numbers on your menus, which I know is a big concern with the industry. And then the toppings, the FDA did provide a really basic example of toppings labeling in the regulations, but this shows in a real life example what it looks like. Each topping listed individually, and then the calorie range from the smallest size up to the largest size. And last thing to touch on with the draft guidance is what the FDA said in regards to enforcement. So this is a screenshot taken directly from the draft. So the FDA is not going to be out for blood. They want these regulations to be successful. They want guests to enjoy the information. They want covered establishments to be able to show this information in a way that's not overly burdensome for them. So they're willing to work with the industry by not punishing covered establishments immediately for minor infractions. They list a couple of those here, what they believe would be minor. They want the establishment to have the opportunity to correct those. So that will be done probably through warning letters. So if again, we don't totally know what their enforcement policy is going to look like, but say it falls in the hands of local health inspectors. So if someone comes in and finds that a number wasn't rounded correctly, the font size is a little too small, and maybe it's a little too hard to read with the colors that were selected, that establishment would get a warning letter telling them what was wrong, telling them what needs to be updated in order for them to be compliant, and they'd get the opportunity to make those updates without immediately facing a financial penalty or public acknowledgement of that information being wrong. Again, we don't totally know what it will look like, and we won't know until that's finalized, but that's certainly the impression that we've received through our talks with the FDA and through the release of this draft guidance, that they want to work with the industry first before any big penalties start to come down. Okay, so if we could take a look into our crystal ball, this is what we think the industry can expect to come next. We do think that enforcement will start on May 7th, 2018. Dr. Gottlieb, the FDA commissioner, does seem committed to keeping this date. There's a quote from him at the bottom of this slide. This was part of the announcement when that draft guidance was released. He says that I'm fully committed to implementing these provisions on the timetable we've already announced. So that means that by May 7th, the industry will be expected to be compliant, and hopefully long before then we will have that final guidance document. We're expecting that soon. And again, no more delays from the FDA. We know that there are industry groups that are still trying to get some more time to make some changes to the regulations, but if it was just up to the FDA, we do believe that it'll go through as planned May 7th. Okay, now for the moment I know you've all been waiting for, which is the Common Sense Nutrition Disclosure Act. This is a bill that was put through the House was that last week already? Mm-hmm. Last Tuesday it went up for a vote in the House, and it was passed by a pretty considerable margin. You can see the numbers down there in that graphic. So now that it's passed the House, it's on to the Senate. In the Senate, it will be considered for a vote. If it's passed, then it will go to the President's desk where it can be signed into law. And what the Common Sense Nutrition Disclosure Act is all about is making some changes to the existing regulations, so much so that it would need to be rewritten by the FDA. So it would extend the enforcement date by several years, and the industry would be looking at a new set of regulations. The convenience store folks, the grocery store folks, not trying to make too many generalizations, but those are the big names behind the push to get this passed, along with the pizza folks. They're looking for some changes to the way that the FDA would enforce the regulations, so making it very clear that there wouldn't be any criminal penalties to not complying with the regulations. It would also make changes for establishments that take most of their orders from the phone or online, so the pizza guys. It would make it so they don't have to label their in-store menus. It would also make changes to multi-serving dishes, how covered establishments can label those. Right now, we don't believe that there's a really strong chance of this going through. Obviously, we don't know for sure. We just know that this similar bill, this exact bill actually, went through the same process around the same time last year, and it never made it out of the subcommittee in the Senate. So we are closely. I do want to say that if you're looking for updates on the Common Sense Nutrition Disclosure Act or just labeling regulations in general, we do release a monthly newsletter. You can go to menutrinfo.com to sign up for that, and that's a surefire way to get those updates sent to your inbox. Okay, so as we look towards May 7th as the enforcement date, since we're moving ahead as if this is going to be the enforcement date, no more delays this time, here's some questions to ask yourself to see if you're ready. First and foremost, do you know if you're covered? So do you fit those? Are all of your menu items analyzed? Do you trust the information that you have? Are all of your menus and menu boards compliant? Is your additional nutrition information ready? And if you have it in a digital format, do you have a way of while they're dining in-house? Does your staff know what to expect? I think that's a big one that covered establishments kind of forget about. As they get all this information ready, they forget that at the forefront of this all is the staff that's making the food. If they aren't following recipes, your numbers are no longer compliant and you could be running into issues. So staff training definitely should come into play. Are your certifications ready? Can you prove your reasonable basis? Can you prove that you're taking all of the steps necessary to provide food that aligns with your posted nutritional values? And finally, do you know how you'll handle changes and updates internally? Nowhere in the regulations did the FDA set an allowable time frame from a recipe change or an ingredient change to when the posted nutrition information needs to be updated. They just expect that as you're moving forward, that's something that you take into consideration and that your numbers are always accurate. So are you going to just make regularly scheduled updates to your menu and you'll know that you'll update your menu boards at that time? Will you make changes with your supplier so you're only receiving items that fall within a certain number of calories or amount of sodium per serving? Those are all the kinds of things that you should start to think about once all your data is analyzed and all of your menus and menu boards are ready to print. Okay, so after we go through these questions, I'm curious if anyone's answers to the poll questions have changed. So does anyone feel less ready, more ready for the regulations? Does anyone have any new or different worries when it comes to menu labeling? If you want to type those in, I'll go ahead and move along to the next slide, which is what the industry can expect after May 7th when we all take a collective sigh of relief once the enforcement date hits. A big one regarding nutrition is the sodium warnings. So we've seen it already in New York City where if a covered establishment has a menu item with more than, I believe, 2,300 milligrams of sodium, there's a little warning symbol, and you can see that here on the slide with a little salt shaker. That has to be posted next to those menu items so consumers know that those do carry quite a bit of sodium. And Philadelphia, just a couple weeks ago, is proposing similar legislation. So in addition to having calories on your menus and menu boards, you might also have to start thinking about these sodium warnings if you are in those two locations. And then finally, allergens. That's something that we're always talking about here at Menu Trinfo. We've started to see more and more training laws come into place, but that's certainly not to say that an allergen labeling law might never hit the industry. So one of the benefits of menu labeling is that you're nailing down your recipes, you're nailing down your order guide, so a logical next step is releasing allergen information to your consumers, and that might be the next thing that's required. All right. So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Julie.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire. What a great webinar. So we have been compiling your questions as you've been sending them in, and I promise we'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. But before we do, we wanted to share some suggestions that we have for you after today's webinar. The first is to fill out the survey that's going to be hitting your email once we sign off here. And we will take your comments and criticisms to heart. We truly want to know what we did well and what we should do better, what we can improve on. So please send us your honest feedback. And finally, to stay up with current news, legislation, and more, as Claire already mentioned, feel free to sign up for our newsletter at menutrinfo.com. You can see the web address there. And that's going to give you all the potential changes coming to the food industry this year, and it's going to be a great resource for you and your brand. All right, and if you're looking for more help with your nutrition information, or after this webinar you feel like you need a bunch more help getting compliant with your menus and menu boards, we're here to help you. If you're interested in learning more about our services, please shoot us an email. You can see that email address there. That's info@menutrinfo.com, or feel free to give us a call at 970-295-4370. And this is the last thing I'll mention before we get to all of your questions, and it's something that we are very excited about. Mark your calendars for Tuesday, March 13th, because we are going to have a very special webinar headed your way. We've gathered 3 industry leaders who have already successfully navigated the menu labeling regulations and have tons of valuable lessons and advice to offer to you all. They'll be answering your questions as well as our questions when it comes to menu labeling challenges that they've faced, how they overcame them, and what advice they have for the rest of the industry. A link to register for this webinar will be in our follow-up email, so please register for that webinar. All right, and at this time, we'd like to go ahead and answer the questions that we've been receiving through today's webinar. So one of the main questions I got come through a couple of times is, will we be provided the slides after the webinar today? As I already mentioned at the beginning, we won't be providing the slides, but we have recorded the webinar. So that's just a friendly reminder to everyone there. All right, some other questions that we've been receiving. Since there are new-ish regulations for menu boards regarding sodium in NYC, allergen, and raw and undercooked disclaimers, do we see any movement on national regulations on these?
That's a great question. I haven't heard anything regarding national policies for sodium, allergens, or raw and undercooked food. Has surprisingly been rather vocal about their nutrition policies and wanting to set some new standards. They're still in the beginning phases of working through their priorities as all of the budget stuff gets nailed down as it's doing right now. We'll look to see what their priorities are, what they're wanting to accomplish. I know that they have a lot on the drug side that they're working towards for this first part of the administration. So nothing that we've heard of, but the FDA hasn't released a complete timeline of their plans quite yet.
Awesome, great. All right, next question. If none of our items contain trans fat, can this line be eliminated?
So the FDA, in the regulations, they provide the nutrients that are required, which does include trans fat, and then it also includes a simplified format that can be used. So if you wanted to eliminate certain nutrients, you would have to have an additional disclaimer that says not a significant source of X, Y, and Z. So I guess across the board, if a nutrient is absent, you can't just remove it from your additional nutrition information completely. However, if you have some really simple menu items like beverages is a great example, and they're void of a lot of the nutrients, then you can leave those off and replace them with that disclaimer statement instead.
Okay. This question says, we have a recipe nutritional database on all of our accounts' computers with additional nutrition information, and we were told that we could go ahead and look it up and tell the customer. Can we do that, or do we have to have something they can use to look it up themselves?
That is a great question. I think as long as the guest has access to that information while they're placing an order, then that would be fine. So if that's involves a staff member going back to check on certain menu items, I guess I don't see a problem with that. You just want to make sure that that staff member is well trained on, make sure that they have all the tools in place to find the exact menu items that are being requested, and if there are any questions about, certain nutrients, or, I have this condition, what can I eat, make sure that that's all taken care of before that May 7th deadline.
Awesome. This next question says, who will be auditing restaurants?
That is a wonderful question, and that's one that we've been waiting on for quite some time. Again, in the draft guidance, the FDA did touch on enforcement. It was more so saying that they'd be working with the industry rather than laying out all these penalties right off the bat. As far as a full regulatory plan, we're still kind of waiting on that. We'll see if they take it as part of the FDA's responsibilities, if they contract with local health departments. We're not totally sure, but we do believe probably the biggest area where restaurants are going to see questions or might see complaints is from consumers. The FDA does have a hotline that was originally for retail food. So if someone thought that something was labeled incorrectly or had questions about the way something was labeled, the FDA will open up that hotline to menu labeling questions too. So if 12 people call in within a week all complaining about a certain restaurant, then the FDA may be more inclined to go after them first once they do get this enforcement policy nailed down. Again, that's all just what our guess would be. We don't know anything for sure until the FDA releases it, but we're thinking that enforcement would probably become as a result of any sort of complaints from consumers.
Okay, awesome. Are institutional dining halls and retail dining associated with college and university dining services covered?
So when it comes to covered establishments, really the only things that are off limits are elementary, middle, and high schools. Those are covered under the USDA, and then prisons and jails. Those are handled differently as well. So if there's an establishment that's selling restaurant-type food, if they have 20 or more locations, and if they're doing business under the same name, regardless of whether that's on a college campus, if that's a restaurant, if that's a convenience store, they will be covered. So I don't know if I've seen a great example of a location on a college campus that would require labeling, but if there's university convenience store, quick stop convenience store, and there are 20 or more of those on a college campus, it would have to be a pretty big college campus, I guess, but that would be covered under those regulations. So I think it's probably more rare that you'd see it on a college campus than elsewhere, but that's not to say that it's not possible.
Okay, awesome. All right, next question says, does the law state that restaurants/cafes must keep a log of the number of days per year a product is sold to verify that it is less than 60 days?
There's nothing in the regulations that mentions a log to keep that information. I think just like with the reasonable basis for posting the numbers that you're posting, a similar situation would come into play with this. So if someone comes in and decides to audit your information and they see that, oh, this sandwich isn't labeled, why is that? They might ask for, when is the first date you started selling this? When is the last date? Has it been sold any other time throughout the year? So I don't think that it's something you necessarily need to produce because of menu labeling, but just be aware that it's something that might be asked from you if there are questions.
Okay, great. Next question, does this menu labeling FDA law supersede state and local laws?
Yes, so it does preempt any local laws that affect covered establishments. So New York City, California, Philadelphia, King County, Washington, they all had their own menu labeling laws before they came into place. And I think the majority of those have adopted identical regulations to the FDA to make them able to enforce those at a local level. that are passed on a local level that are different from the FDA's regulations. So a good example is the sodium regulation in New York City. That's something that's totally different from the FDA's menu labeling regulations. So New York City can still enforce their sodium regulations while the FDA takes on menu labeling.
Okay, awesome. Next question is, where does a food truck fit in with this guidance?
Okay, so I think this is probably one of my favorite questions, and we get this one all the time, and it's just kind of a funny answer. The FDA considers a covered establishment to have 20 or more locations, and those locations have to have a fixed physical site. So planes, trains, automobiles are all exempt because they all move around. So the airlines are exempt, Amtrak is exempt, and that includes food trucks, unless there are 20 of them with, I don't know, they'd move around anyway. So no, food trucks are not covered under the regulations for that reason.
All right, great. All right, next question. Should we put our menu updates on hold because of the Common Sense Nutrition Disclosure Act?
All right, so that's been the most popular question we've been receiving this past week. Just based on the low chance that it will pass, again, based on what happened to it last year, based on the pretty minimal movement we've seen in the Senate, it didn't pick up quite as many co-sponsors, quite as much support as it did in the House. We're still telling our clients to move forward as if May 7th, 2018 is going to go through as the enforcement date. These next couple of months are really critical. Obviously, you'll want to have your nutritional analysis done. You'll need to have your menus and menu boards updated, your additional nutrition information prepared, all of your staff trained. That's a lot to get done, and we're just a couple of months away. So this Common Sense Nutrition Disclosure Act, we know that there are a lot in the industry who are excited about it, but we're worried that it might become too much of a distraction and take away from the really important stuff, which is getting compliant with the regulations in a pretty short amount of time. So if it was our client asking us that, we would recommend still moving forward, even if it's just getting all of your menus and menu boards ready, not necessarily sending them to the printer if there's a lot of hesitation, but steps should still be taken to move forward so you aren't in a bad position in a couple of weeks.
Awesome. Great advice. All right, next question. Haven't studies shown that menu labeling doesn't actually change what people want to order?
So the jury's still out on menu labeling's impact on public health and on consumer decision making. There are studies on both sides. There are some that show that there's a consistent calorie decrease in someone's order before and after they're shown nutrition information, and there are studies that show there's no change in what they order. And I don't think there's been one great study yet that has been able to prove one way or another what menu labeling's impact is. Something to keep in mind is that consumers really enjoy dining out. They like, they have their favorite meals at restaurants. They have their favorite thing to get at the grocery store or convenience store. So while they may not change that order because those are foods that they're really fond of, they might make different decisions throughout the day with what else they eat. So they see that my favorite cheeseburger has 1,200 calories, maybe I'll go a little bit light on lunch and still be able to indulge at dinner. And I don't think that there's been a study to show that yet. So we'll see moving forward. Obviously, once this is a mandate, it's going to be a lot easier to pull data in and to see what happens. But yeah, jury's still out as far as giving consumers more information. But I think that's something that will ultimately have positive results.
Great, excellent. All right, this question says, I'm in New York City and I have 20 locations. Do I need to comply with the city law here before May 7th?
Okay, so we had some drama with New York City a few months ago after the FDA on May 4th, 2017, once they announced this current 1-year delay, New York City, who's had local laws in place since 2010, they decided that they would enforce the local law during this delay, and it caused all sorts of, oh man, the industry was getting upset, the FDA was getting upset. So through all of this, the New York City and the FDA came to an agreement that they would not enforce the local law until the federal law goes into play, which is May 7, 2018. So if you're a covered establishment in New York City, you aren't being held to these labeling criteria quite yet, but come May 7th, you will be needing to be compliant with the federal regulations.
Okay, excellent. Next question is, any chance that we could see sesame or corn added to make a top 10 allergen?
I think it's certainly a possibility. I don't know. I'd hold if you should hold your breath on that one quite yet. There has been talk of extending the top 8 allergens to include some additional items. The current administration hasn't vocalized this as a huge priority. So I would say it's good to have the information available if consumers are asking for it, but as far as retail labeling goes, it's probably not something you'll see in the immediate future.
Okay. All right, next question. Is there still a pending menu labeling lawsuit?
Yes and no. CSPI, Center for Science in the Public Interest, they're a big menu labeling advocate. When this most recent delay was announced, they did file a lawsuit against the FDA saying that what they did wasn't legal, that they shouldn't have been able to announce a delay one day before this regulation was set to be enforced. They did come to a mutual agreement a few months ago that the lawsuit would be taken off the table unless the FDA failed to have the enforcement date stay as May 7, 2018. So if the FDA, for whatever reason, doesn't meet that deadline, then we might see that lawsuit come back into play. But right now, there's nothing active with that.
Okay, excellent.
It's time for one more.
All right, this last question says, don't individually wrapped items, such as the salad you showed, also have to have full ingredient lists where the item was packaged as well as the name of the item on the sticker label?
Okay, so regarding all of that information, the requirements for labeling of grab-and-go products outside of menu labeling, that would fall under your state's food code. So if there are any questions regarding what needs to be labeled and what information you need to have available, we'd recommend checking out the local food code where you're selling your food.
Excellent. All right. Thank you guys for participating in this webinar today. We had a ton of questions come in, and we weren't able to address all of them here in this time and space. So if you did have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. Again, our contact information will be in that follow-up email. And again, we would definitely love for you to take a few minutes and fill out the survey and let us know what you loved and what we could improve on. So also register for that upcoming webinar in March. It's going to be awesome. Thank you guys so much for participating, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.